Yesterday, you will recall, we were talking about Carl Rogers, a clinical psychologist who developed a different theory, really, about personality. And I was wondering, as you were listening to Rogers, were there any thoughts that came to your mind about how he differs from some of the other people that we've been studying? Any observations that you made about Rogers' way of looking at things? Sure.
More oriented towards the people.
Much more oriented towards people. That's very true. Very interpersonal kind of theory. Yes. Excellent. What else? Anything else you noticed about Carl Rogers' theory? Sure.
He was kind of humble and he was kind of empathetic towards his patients.
Well, that's very good. Yes, as a person, actually, people who knew Rogers saw him, especially throughout most of his early and middle career, as being a very humble man, a very quiet but involved person. So that certainly is very accurate. Yes?
In the book, it seemed like when I was reading that he had a positive outlook on life. He didn't think that there was something wrong with everybody, where it seems all the other people we've studied have said, oh, you've got this problem and it's deep down. He said, there's a way to fix it. You're fine. You're there's a way to go from here, and you're not doomed to this life of misery.
Ah, excellent. Yes. One of the things that you will see with Rogers and with some of the other people we're going to talk about immediately after him is that their focus is really on the fact that people are good, and that there are aspirations we all have, to be more self-fulfilled and to move towards being kind of the best person that we can be. And, very different from some of the theorists who were positing things like, you're really driven by these impulses in you. You're at war with yourself in a way. Especially, the extreme, perhaps, is with Freud, where, your ego is there to try to protect you from all of these primitive urges coming from your id. And Rogers comes along, and he is going to posit many more positive things about people and about how you grow. Now, there's an interesting thing with Rogers, though, and that is, if you notice, as I've been presenting some of the aspects of his theory, I've been talking almost from the beginning about his system of psychotherapy. And that's what's different with Rogers, is that he builds a very positive theory of personality, but actually he also is building it out of his system of psychotherapy. Now, part of the reason for that is that Rogers thought that if you just were allowed to evolve, that is, if you grew up in a family where you were loved and cared for, and there was a lot of stimulation, and there were lots of good people around you, and you had good relationships, that your personality would simply unfold. And so it's only when there are problems, it's only when you have traumatic experiences, or you lack models, or you develop, for perhaps very complex reasons, an image of yourself that is not very positive, that therapy becomes necessary. And so what he did then was to build for us a theory around what are the things that would have to happen in therapy to correct for whatever problems occurred. And so as he builds a system that we're in the middle of discussing now, he's really trying to help us to see that you can overcome obstacles. That is, the fact that something went wrong at some time in your life, perhaps at several times in your life, does not mean that your personality won't unfold and you won't be a very productive, happy person later on, but you may need some help. And so he felt there were stages that one went through in this helping process, and that certain things had to happen before other things could happen. And then, as you went through the process of therapy, his observations were that there were some experiences that happened prior to others, and that actually, you built on that series. Now, we had just yesterday finished, we had talked about 6 conditions that have to go on between the therapist and the client. And then we started talking that if these 6 conditions exist, then there were 10 changes that he saw that might occur with a person. And I'll briefly mention the first 5 because we did begin to talk about them yesterday. The first thing he said is that clients, if they've met the conditions we talked about, will begin to express their feelings more clearly. In fact, I'll just flash these up as soon as let's see. Okay, here we are. That clients will increasingly express their feelings about their lives and their problems. And remember now, this is going on because a relationship has developed between the therapist and the client where this becomes a safe thing to do. And what Rogers is saying is you do have to reach a point where you can actually disclose to another person whatever your problems are. And that the ideal environment to do that is with someone who passes no judgment on you, someone who is very willing to listen to you, no matter how bad you may think something you have done is. This other person does not respond as if it's bad. This other person simply responds that as if you basically are a very good person. So if there are some problems that you have, they can be discussed, and they don't have to be discussed in a way where the other person is judgmental. Now, what he said is, if you get people talking about their problems, they will become increasingly accurate in the assessment of the meaning of their feelings. So he starts off with the premise that, if really bad things have happened, you may know that bad things have happened. In other words, you may know that you're unhappy. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a profound understanding of that. And in fact, because you are unhappy, you may have chosen to not let yourself really think much about this. So it takes a while in talking to someone else to begin to, kind of get an accurate picture of what it is that you're distressed about. Then he said, clients will begin to discuss the incongruity between their self-concepts and their experiences. And, that's the important time I was mentioning before, where the person may have a view of themselves that is, and it's really a view they want to have of themselves, that is really not the way they are. And, yesterday I was describing that you could have the situation where someone wants to see himself or herself as very warm, outgoing, a nice person, but other people experience that individual as cold, as aloof, as not very giving. Now, that's a pretty big discrepancy between the self-concept one wants to have and the person that other people experience when they talk to you. And so what Rogers was saying is you've got to get to the point of helping a person to see that self-concept that they talk about, that is that sense of who they want to be, is not at all the person other people are seeing. And so the question, obviously, then in therapy becomes, well, what has to happen for this to change? And the next level, of course, that the therapist then has to take the client to is discovering, why is it that you want to be warm and outgoing? You think that's the kind of person you wish to be. In fact, you've even deluded yourself into thinking you kind of are that way. But in reality, you're standoffish, you're aloof, you don't give much in relationships. And that becomes the dilemma that gets discussed in therapy. Like, what is going on inside someone that makes them so self-protective, that causes them to behave in a way that is so different than how they actually wish to be perceived? Now, after that, what happens is, as the client and therapist talk about these things, the client becomes threatened by the incongruity. That is, the client becomes threatened by the fact that, you know, when someone asks me what I'm like, I always say, well, you know, I'm the kind of warm, spontaneous, affectionate type. And now I'm discovering, actually, I'm rather aloof. People don't see me as warm. People don't see me as a desirable person to have as a friend. People think I really don't seem to understand at all the way I present myself. This generates anxiety. And in this case, of course, the anxiety is healthy, because you have got to get distressed about the way you're presenting yourself in order for you to begin to look at, well, what changes would I have to make so that I could really become the person I would like to be. So this is a very, important time. And, for some people, the anxiety becomes too much, and they run away. And one of the most important things in therapy is that you don't rush a person when they're coming into this stage. That is, as the person begins to experience more and more anxiety over the fact that, I am not really like the person I ideally want to be like. And you begin to look for the reasons why. You want to be sure that the person experiences some anxiety so that they're distressed and want to change. But you don't want them to be overwhelmed by the anxiety, to have this feeling, I could never change, and to flee therapy. Now, then Rogers says, clients will then begin to experience fully in awareness, that is consciously, they will begin to experience feelings that have in the past been denied to awareness or distorted in awareness. Now, this is obviously a very important time, because this is when the client begins to become aware that perhaps there were some traumatic events in my life that have caused me to be fearful of actually being the person that I think I want to be. And this really becomes key. This is the time when, a person may have been rejected, may have been told by parents or other important people that they will never be successful, or that others will never like them, or that they're not like their brother or sister, or they're not like the kid next door, or whatever. And so, on one hand, our young person looked around and saw that it's really nice if you can be warm and responsive to other people. People seem to like you. That's how I'm going to be. But the person doesn't become that way because they have another internalized image, which is, I'm not an acceptable person. So if I were, look at what happens with my parents. My parents are always putting me down. I can't be warm and close to them. I'm always being told that I'm not nearly as good as my brother or sister. And if in school, when the child goes off to school, some of the early experiences are that they don't get into the so-called in-group, then they develop a lot of self-protective mechanisms. This is the time in therapy then where you try to get the person to recall this, and people do recall these things, and to begin to talk about all the fears there are in actually being the person you would like to be. Now, again, it's a very important time. And that's where we were, during the last class, as we had gotten to this point, and we were talking about how these distortions can take place. Now, the next thing that happens then is clients become capable of recognizing their self-concepts by assimilating these previously threatening experiences. That is, the person begins to realize what I have said about myself is not accurate. I am not a warm, affectionate, outgoing person. What the person realizes is, I want to be such a person. But that's not really the way I am. And I'm not that way because I'm scared. Or I have been told I could never be that way. So I don't feel that I have the ability, or more importantly and more profoundly, the person feels, were I to try to be the person I honestly want to be, people would reject me. I would get hurt. So what I do is I don't put myself in the circumstances that will allow me to be hurt. So I don't get close to people. I'm not spontaneous. I don't show a lot of regard or affection for others. And of course, what happens then is, since the person doesn't do all these things that would be kind of characteristic of the self-concept they want, then no one responds to them the way they would like to be responded to. And this becomes at a period where the first adjustment that has to be made is one recognizes there is quite a difference between the me I wish to be and the me I now am. Now, as therapy continues, clients' self-concepts will become increasingly congruent with their experience. Now, this is a very significant change, because this means that the person's self-concept becomes more the person that others perceive. So the individual begins to realize, actually, the way I am now, I am kind of an aloof person. I'm not very responsive to others. I don't really give of myself. I'm actually quite anxious in interpersonal situations. I'm scared when I'm in interpersonal situations. In fact, I kind of believe if I were really to approach some of the people I would like to befriend, they would have nothing to do with me. Now, that's a pretty dramatic change then in a person and in their self-concept, but they now at least understand themselves much better than before. Before, they had this fantasy about who they might be, which was totally at odds with their experiences. Now, as they begin to get more in touch with the way they really are, they realize why people are not responding to them. They realize why it is that life is not going the way that they would like it to go. And that's very important. It doesn't mean that the person is going to remain this way at all. But it means in order to make progress, you have to have arrived at a point where you actually understand how you are now. Now, Rogers said then that clients will become increasingly capable of experiencing the therapist's unconditional positive regard for them. Now, if you recall, I mentioned this a long time ago, right at the beginning when we were talking, and I was saying the therapist has to have unconditional positive regard for the client if therapy is going to be successful. Now we've gone through a whole bunch of stages, and I come and say to you, this is when the client becomes more capable of experiencing this regard. And this is the important part to keep in mind. Therapy won't work, according to Rogers, and people won't grow unless the therapist accepts the person just as the person is. However the person is, the therapist responds to them, as far as I am concerned, you are fine. You are a very good person, and I'm going to respond to you and take you with all your foibles, with all of your eccentricities, with perhaps all of your failures. It doesn't matter. I will always respond caringly to you. And the therapist does that throughout the therapy. But it's only when you get to this stage that the client really begins to understand you know, it's funny, I've told this person that I'm frightened, and I've told this person I've been a failure in interpersonal relationships, and I've told this person that people don't respond to me, and whenever I try to be a member of a group I'd like to be in, I feel I get rejected, and in fact I don't even try anymore because I'm really protecting myself. And through all of this, you know, this therapist is not upset about any of this. In fact, the therapist keeps responding to me as if I'm really a very good person. And the client begins to realize that, you know, this is not what I expected. What I expect in relationships is I will be rejected. And if I'm not rejected, I at least will be unsuccessful. Because deep down, I haven't felt that I'm very desirable. But, you know, maybe this is not true. I mean, look what's happening to me with this person. This person is showing all kinds of regard for me, and most importantly, unlike perhaps my parents, this person doesn't say hostile things to me. This person doesn't make little of my aspirations. This person has never suggested to me I couldn't be the kind of person I would like to be. This person doesn't suggest that the mistakes that I've made are really horrible mistakes that you can't recover from. And so it takes a long time of the therapist really showing unconditional positive regard before the client actually begins to have that experience that, you know, I am with someone who cares about me. Then what happens with that, and this is the big jump, as the client really understands that, you know, the therapist has no problem with the way I am, the client begins to realize, you know, maybe I'm okay. Maybe I'm a better person than I thought. And perhaps the situation is that I can do more. In fact, importantly, I could actually become the person I want to become. And it is only when the client really develops this regard for themselves that you get the real change where the person is now more equipped to be risk-taking. And what happens then is, Roger says, clients will come to evaluate their own experience more in terms of their organismic valuing process and less in terms of the values endorsed by other people. Now, organismic valuing process sounds like, what are they talking about? Well, what Rogers believed was that people really have an innate ability to evaluate themselves, that people are constantly evaluating themselves. And what becomes important is that they're able to reflect on what is it that I would wish to have that will make me valuable, rather than what is it that other people, or what is it I think other people want me to be. And so the person really begins to focus on themselves and on their aspirations. But now we're talking about a new person. We're talking about a person who hasn't deceived himself or herself by thinking they are one kind of person when they're really another. Now we have a person who actually understands, this is kind of the way I am, but I have the power to change. I have the power to become the kind of person I want to become, and actually, other people could value me for this. Look what it's like when I'm with this therapist. The therapist doesn't have any trouble, you know, valuing me for the way I am, and so if it can happen here, it can happen in other places. Now, Rogers thought that if one gets through this entire process, that people will become what they existentially are, rather than what other people think they ought to be. And this word existential comes up a lot with Rogers. It'll come up with our next person, Abraham Maslow. What it really means is that the person becomes the individual that they are seeking to be. That is, they are able to understand that they have determined their values, they have set the course of their life, and they are able to respond in the current environment in the way that they would like to. Now, Rogers believed that there were certain outcomes to successful therapy. And one of them, the most important one, he said, and this is the existential part, that a person becomes a fully functioning person. And his way of looking at this was that if you are a fully functioning person, then there are certain characteristics you will have. And the first one is the person is open to experiences. And what he meant by this is that if you're open to experiences, you're open to more stimuli in your life. That is, it's almost like you've got greater peripheral vision. You know, you see more about what is happening around you. You're not frightened of all of the things that are in your culture. In fact, as you become freer and freer, as you become this fully functioning person, you like stimulation, especially stimulation that perhaps is new to you. Now, if you recall, I'd also mentioned that, you know, there are some people who get so frightened of stimulation that the first thing they do is to try to make it like something else. And I know people like this. Whenever I say something to them, they say, oh, that's just like, and they immediately try to make whatever it is I've said, even if I think this is kind of a new idea. I find that for some people, they will say, well, that reminds me of, or that was just like, or if I tell them an experience I'm having, they will say, well, I had an experience just like that. What that means often, and it can mean two things. It can mean that the person is too frightened of a new experience to be able to tolerate it. It scares them. And so they make it familiar to themselves so that it's really not new. Now, the other possibility, and this is the very positive one that could go on between two people, and that is someone could say to you, I understand what you mean because such and such happened to me. And it could be that there is a real congruence between that. That is, your excitement and the disclosure you're making may really be about an experience that someone else really has had. And they know what it is you're going through. And they're trying to tell you, I understand what it is that's happening to you, and it's a wonderful thing. And I want you to know that, I appreciate that you should be excited about this. So that there is a healthy part to this also. Now, the successfully or the fully functioning person will also be characterized by existential living. And what Rogers meant here is that new experiences will happen to people, and they'll be able to respond in the present. That is, they'll be able to recognize that, gee, this has never happened to me before. This is very interesting. I wonder what it means. And importantly, to not be frightened. The fact that it's new, doesn't take on the characteristic that I have to be frightened of it. Then next, Rogers says, these people trust their organisms. And he meant that people trust their experience and their sense of being in tune with whatever is the meaning of their experience. It doesn't mean, by the way, that the person is always right. The fact that someone trusts their kind of bodily experience doesn't mean that it's necessarily accurate. For example, if someone feels, boy, there's a smashing person, and I would really like to get to know him or her. Now, it may be that, and I'm picking up vibes from him or her that person would like to get to know me. Well, what this person knows and begins to understand is most of the time I'm right. That is, if I see somebody that I think is really neat and I actually approach them, they'll respond well. But sometimes the other person doesn't respond well. Sometimes it's not reciprocal. The other person doesn't feel that way about you. So what happens? Well, you find out, I was wrong this time. But it's not traumatic. Maybe a bit painful. And certainly, you may feel rejected. But you trust enough in yourself that you don't say, there I am. I always choose the wrong people. I always make mistakes when I get into relationships. I always approach people who really will not like me. Instead, what the person says to themselves is, I wonder what I missed this time. Because, actually, when I see somebody that I want to get involved with and I want to approach, usually people want to engage me at least for a while, and this person kind of blew me away right away. I wonder what I missed. But it's not an overwhelming rejection. It's a real understanding that, sometimes I will be wrong, but most of the time I will be right. And so I should continue to trust my feelings, that when I wish to pursue another person or I wish to do something, I should feel confident it usually will work. Then Rogers said, you will observe that these people are creative. And Rogers thought that the person who was fully functioning would reach out for new experiences and wander along new paths with a sense of adventure that would lead them to growth. This is part of the concept I mentioned earlier, that when you get this kind of peripheral vision, the step that occurs a little later is you begin looking for things that are new. Now, that's in contrast, unfortunately, to many people who spend much of their lives looking for things that are familiar, because the new is scary, and so people want to keep control of their life. So the way you keep control of your life is you kind of keep repeating things that work. Here he's saying the really fully functioning person is someone who is looking for new experiences and then goes down a path. And first of all, that often involves decision making. Often you have choices of several paths, so you got to choose one. But the creative person doesn't necessarily choose the safe one or the most familiar one. The person might choose the most stimulating, the most exciting one, and then move on from there. Then, what he observed is that fully functioning people live richer lives than other people. And he did not necessarily mean, by the way, when he said this, that these people lead easier lives. As you can tell from what I've been saying, Rogers actually felt that, people take risks, and that it's very important that the mature person take risks. And if you take risks, then occasionally you're going to experience pain. And also you may be forced to face, certain challenges. And for people who are fully functioning, some people face challenges very courageously. That's really a part of themselves that even though they realize it's high risk, this may not happen, they have the courage to try it because internally what they're saying is, this is what I would like to do and this is the kind of person I would like to be. Now, there's an interesting thing that actually occurs with Rogers as he himself personally became more accepted. It allowed him to get in, that is, as his theory became more accepted. And Rogers is one of those theorists, that when he first started talking and people began listening, they got very excited about what he was saying. He was very different than the psychoanalysts. He was very refreshing. He had a message that people are good, and that, by the way, if you're stopped in your life, if you're blocked in your life, if somehow things aren't going the way they should go, we have a therapy system that will help you to get to where you want to get. So what happened to him is he began to see people who were healthier. He began to see people who we might call well-functioning. That is, he moved from that time when he was seeing people who had lots of problems to seeing people who simply wanted to be better than they were, or wanted to have more insight about themselves than they had, or wanted to feel things that perhaps they weren't feeling but they thought they could. And so Rogers then began to write about what he called emerging persons. And such individuals might be corporate executives who want out of their organizational life. It's just not working. They might be clerics or nuns who have been very committed to their religion, but they feel they've grown as much in their religion as they can, and they feel they have to leave it in order to become more themselves. In other words, the very thing they committed themselves to, they're now experiencing as a limitation. Also, he began to work with very emerging persons who were members of minority groups, or in some case, women, who were deciding to shed the passivity in their lives and to be more assertive and positive. And they, this generated some anxiety for them, but he wanted to show them, you should tolerate that anxiety. You can be the person you want to be. You don't have to accept the social constraints that you've been living under. So Rogers then described these emerging persons as having certain characteristics. He said, first of all, they are honest and open. And while these persons, Rogers would say, are humanistically oriented, he would say, in addition, these are people who are open about their sexual relationships and their dealings with others. And what he meant here is that, not that one goes out and talks to everybody about your sexual life, but rather that these are people who have the capacity, when their sexual life is not going precisely the way they would like it to go, to talk to whoever their partner is about what the problems are, or even to talk with someone about what one's aspirations are sexually, and to share that with another person. And what he was saying is that the emerging person, who's quite a mature person, can talk about these things. Now, you also want to keep in mind that this is occurring. His theory when he began making these breakthroughs and that, this is about 40 years ago. People did not talk as easily about their intimate lives as people do today. But even today, lots and lots of people have real difficulty in talking about their intimate life in a really honest way. And he was saying that these people develop this. He also said that the honesty in this people helps them to understand that institutions really exist for people, not people for institutions. And so, he would say, it's important if you're part of an organization to understand that somehow that organization should serve you. You've got it mixed up in his idea if you think you should just serve the organization, that the world should not be built on organizations that we can serve, but rather the whole idea of having organizations is so that humankind will be better served. Now next, he said, a characteristic of an emerging person is that they are indifferent to material comforts and rewards. And the main issue here is that people attempt to relate to others in kind of an egalitarian way, rather than use facades and to surround themselves, with material things that say, look, I've got these material things, I'm a great person. Instead, he would say the really authentic person is someone who presents themselves, meaning their values, their aspirations, their goals, their ability to love, and that's what they get accepted for. So he goes on to say that these emerging persons are caring persons. And this is kind of an interesting concept, actually, in Rogers' development. He described caring people as having a deep desire to help others and to help them to be true contributors to society. He also said, and this is what I thought was an interesting development in Rogers, he said these people may even be suspicious of the helping professions, meaning suspicious of psychotherapists like Carl Rogers, because they might wonder, is this person who is supposedly has this unconditional positive regard for me, is this person really feeling that? Or is it that that's how he or she makes a living? And Rogers was, one of the first people to kind of challenge the authenticity of the therapist himself or herself. And of course, what he was really saying is that either can exist. That is, there are people who become psychotherapists, strangely enough, because they can't handle intimacy. Their intimate life is with their patients, where the therapist is in control, where there are real limits as to what can happen, but discussions can be on a very intimate, even profound level. There are other people who are therapists because they themselves have reached a significant degree of maturity. They kind of see the problems that other people have. They genuinely want to help other people. And on an experiential level, they really do know what the other person is going through. But that distinction isn't made enough. And there really are differences. Then he said, these people have a deep distrust of cognitively based science. And they also have a deep distrust of a technology that uses science to exploit and harm nature and people. And once Rogers got to this point, he really was now moving out talking about people who did things that destroyed nature, that people ought to be suspicious of them, that people ought to be suspicious of studies about human beings that are done in tightly controlled laboratories, that he felt these laboratory studies about human behavior probably aren't very authentic. And he took a very interesting stand for a psychologist who is, working in a university where all this kind of stuff goes on. And he says, I'm not so sure we learn much about people this way. Then he said, emerging persons have a trust in their own experience and a profound distrust of all external authority. And what he was really saying is that, people will feel the constraints of external reality, but they don't allow that to set limits on who they are going to be. And he felt that, truly emerging persons might, rebel against the law. For example, he would say, when people see that laws are unfair, the really emerging person doesn't accept it. So he saw when Rosa Parks said, I am not going to sit in the back of the bus, that was a very existential, very adult thing to do, because that law made no sense. And so why should she have to sit in the back of the bus because there's an unjust law? So Rogers would say that her rebellion, her refusal to accept the law, was the kind of adult thing that a creative emerging person would do. Now we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll give you a couple of other examples, and we'll move on with Rogers.